Hello. I don't know if you've been following evening prayer this week, but I'm not doing an evening prayer today because it is Ascension Day, and so there's an Ascension Day service that we are putting up on the Holy Trinity Facebook page and on the YouTube channel. But instead, it's worth thinking about what's going on inside of us at the moment. Now, got to be careful about this, because as you may have heard me say, when we look inside of ourselves, we can get depressed. We are never going to live up to the perfect expectations of God, the exaggerated expectations that we may have of ourselves, or indeed the expectations that our consumerist society try and lay upon us. It's tempting also to go into a fantasy world. You know, the way in which the whole society around us presents us with fantasies, fantasy relationships, fantasy marriages, fantasy hair, fantasy clothing, fantasy families, fantasy children, fantasy pretty much anything. And, you know, that can end up becoming quite oppressive. I want to talk to you about grace for a moment. Now, grace is nothing to do with how somebody moves. That's the sort of the ballet grace, if you like. It's not actually to do with the prayer that some people say at the beginning of a meal, which comes from the Latin word for thanks. Grace is God's undeserved loving kindness, which he gives to us because he loves us. Grace is that thing, that aspect of God that enables us to be with him forever. Grace is the reason we're alive. Grace is the reason that we can get up in the morning with renewed hope. Grace is the reason that we do not need to be depressed about our own shortcomings, because we know that the person whose opinion that really matters, which is God, through Jesus accepts us as we are. Jesus, when he died on the cross, was already thinking of us, because he's not just man but God outside of time. And so when Jesus is praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, he's already thinking about us. And rather than take any of the easy ways out that have been offered to him by the devil, and indeed, I'm sure, by the temptations of the flesh, he chooses to go to the cross, not for himself, but for us. Not for a perfect vision of us, but us as we are. He didn't just go to the cross for his disciples, although that would have been amazing enough in itself, given that the disciples had a lot of trouble understanding Jesus and at times were doing the wrong thing or saying the wrong thing, to the extent that Peter, the rock on which the church is built, denied Jesus 3 times. And if that's true of Peter, if we are far less than perfect, well, the grace of God still applies. But we need to connect with that amazing grace. We need to connect with a God who loves us and forgives us, who knew what he was getting into when he died for us on the cross, who knew what he was getting into when he held out his hands of love. We may not have perceived that that's what's going on, but if you know anything about God, you know anything about Jesus, if you've tried to go to a service at any time, God was reaching out to you. God, the God of the universe, the author of creation, this incredible, multi-dimensional being, was reaching out to little me and little you, just as we are. And we grab hold of this grace by faith. Faith in a God we cannot see, but in whom we trust. Jesus is the gateway. Through faith we enter through that gate. We are saved. And we begin to journey with him. And as we do so, we remember that from now on, we are no longer rebels against God, but soldiers and servants in his service. And our calling is to walk along his narrow way, keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus. Despite all our imperfections, trusting not in our weakness, but in Jesus' strength, until our lives end. And we know that once we put our trust in Jesus, God will be there for us every step of the way. And he's there for you now, if you want him to be.